Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Roberto Alvarez. I'm the Executive Director of the GFCC. The GFCC, it's a global network that spans more than 30 nations today. It's a membership organization. We have universities, corporations, private sector, industry bodies and councils, and government agencies as members of the GFCC. This is the sixth conversation that we're having in this series, Now, Breach, and Reboot. And this conversation, it's about innovation. So let me do three things here in order for us to get started. Briefly introduce you to you what this series is about. Second, talk about the conversation that we are having today with leaders from around the globe. And finally, review logistics. So we started this on May the 6th, Now, Breach, and Reboot, really reacting to the crisis that we are all seeing and living through across the globe. Now, organizations and countries are really reacting and responding to the COVID-19 crisis. But we also see this as an opportunity to build a better and different future, to reboot economy and society. And bridge, it's what is needed to go from the current state to a future state. And this is because what we call this series of conversations, Now, Bridge, and Reboot. We've covered different topics. We talked about response across nations in recent sessions. And one of the key topics that emerged is innovation. I think there are different ways through which innovation is related to this current situation. And I wanted to highlight a few of them. First, we're seeing a lot of innovation for countries and organizations to respond to the crisis. Second, we're seeing innovation priorities changing because of the crisis, how priorities in terms of research or capital allocation are changing. Third, in order to reboot, we will need a lot of innovation. And finally, we also see that some of the models, frameworks, and process that organizations and leaders and innovators and entrepreneurs around the globe use to innovate also are being influenced and changing because of this current situation. So we're here today to review those aspects and above all to think how we can accelerate transformation in the economy and society through innovation. So we're talking about opportunities, we're talking about innovation models, we're talking about priorities in research and investment, so on and so forth. We have 5 amazing speakers from around the globe here today. I'm happy and fortunate to have known some of them for years and to work with most of you or all of you actually. And I'll briefly introduce our speakers. I'll start with my boss, Deborah Winter-Smith. Deborah is the president and CEO of the Council on Competitiveness in the United States and the president of the GFCC. She has a wonderful career spanning private sector, nonprofit, and government in the United States. She was the first Assistant Secretary for Technology Policy to be confirmed by the Congress in the United States. And in that position, she oversaw the implementation of tech transfer offices and a variety of initiatives across the United States. We have Betty Young joining us from Miami today. Betty is a global manager for 500 startups. 500 probably is the most globally diversified venture company today in the globe, having invested in more than 75 nations. Betty, it's a pleasure to have you here. It has been a long time, and you are, to me, in some way, the embodiment of entrepreneurship across a variety of dimensions. So thanks for joining. We have my colleague and friend, Chad Evans, Executive Vice President of the U.S. Council on Competitiveness, and our colleague in the GFCC, our treasurer in the GFCC. Chad has been leading a variety of nationwide initiatives in the United States. He now leads the new Commission on Innovation and Competitiveness Frontier in the United States, working with leaders such as the CEO of Bank of America and others, thinking about innovation frameworks in the United States. It has been an enormous pleasure to work with you for over the years, Chad. I'm not telling people for how long we've been working together. Great to have you here. From Brasilia, we have Jenna Sagazio, our friend and really colleague from, let's say, different things that we did together, not just in the GFCC, but also in some previous capacities in the past. Gianna leads what's MEI in Brazil, which is the entrepreneurship business mobilization for innovation, a private sector driven initiative in Brazil that, to my understanding, is the most important forum, public-private conversation forum that we have in Brazil for several years. It's great to have you here, Gianna. From Wellington today, not Auckland, in New Zealand, we have Professor Jean Matson. Professor Jean Matson is the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research at University of Auckland. He's a global expert and leader on materials nanotechnology. He has been working around the globe with aluminum companies and with minerals and the process that we use to manufacture that. He has been advising the Prime Minister of New Zealand on innovation and research. And it's great to have you here today, Jim. From Japan, we have Professor Michinari Hamaguchi, who now is the president of Japan Science and Technology Agency. Professor Hamaguchi, who's a physician by training, used it to be the president of the University of Nagoya. He has a background in health sciences, and now he leads the main Japanese government agency in the research, technology, and innovation space. It's great to have you here, Professor Hamaguchi. I'm sure this crisis, you have a lot of things to say about this crisis, not just because the position that you have, but also your research background. So wonderful to have you here, sir. So finally, the logistics for this conversation, we are taking questions. If you are joining us, and I see that some colleagues already started to share thoughts, but please use the Q&A feature. I will curate the questions and direct to our speakers. We're going for an initial round of remarks now. Each one of our speakers will have 4 or 5 minutes to share their perspectives. As you already saw, we have perspectives coming from national government agencies, national frameworks organized by private sector, university, investment, entrepreneurship. So it's wonderful, and it's important to have this cross-pollination of perspectives. Once again, please use the Q&A feature to share your questions and comments. This session is being recorded. We are broadcasting on Zoom, but we are also broadcasting on YouTube. It will be available afterwards for you to check, to share with your friends, and we are also creating a short report and a short video clip for this conversation. So to get us started, Deborah, I would like to turn to you for your initial remarks, and then after you, we'll go to Japan. Deborah, the floor is yours. Okay, Deborah, you are muted. Okay, here we go.
Great. Good morning and good evening. It's just a great pleasure to see my friends and colleagues from around the world joining us today for this 6th GFCC conversation about how we've dealt in our own nations and around the world in the COVID-19 global pandemic and what it really means as we move forward to the resiliency, the sustainability, and the innovation capacity that will ensure going forward that we have strong, resilient, and strong global economies. Let me just start by saying that all the innovation that we have as nations been leading in last years, talking about the digitization of everything, really has come forward full circle in dealing with the global pandemic. While from the very beginning, we were able to communicate through the very deep, strong digital networks, the robust telecommunication systems around the world, which of course are enabling this call today. What really came out very strongly in the most early stark ways is that the data we had was not really verifiable or transparent. And while we were awash in data, it did not give us the understanding and the knowledge and the capacity to really know exactly how to respond, how to coordinate our efforts in our own nations, and of course, globally as well. So that is one of the kind of core foundational issues moving forward is Yes, information technology, digitization, data, but we also have to have the systems for integrity of data, verification of data, and the ability to use this in order to achieve sustainability and resiliency in not just our economies, but very importantly in our personal lives and how we work. The other thing that I think is really amazing when you think about the response very early on to nations responding to the pandemic is how quickly we moved with new innovation models in telemedicine. I'll just say in the United States, we've had pilots and small telemedicine activities for many, many years, but it wasn't until responding to the pandemic and the necessity of having isolation, lockdowns, that telemedicine really came into the mainstream. And now it's here to stay. And we've seen rapid changes in regulatory environments to enable that. So, and the second, of course, is the telework, the telecommuting. All of us, as we're working now in new ways, billions of people around the world left physical offices and were able to work in a tele environment. And that, again, is a transformational innovation in how we work. And then the third is teleeducation. How many schools, from grade schools, high schools to university, within weeks went online? We'll give one example in the US that's pretty exciting, but underscores this. Arizona State University, our largest public university, within 2 weeks had 40,000 learners online. And now we're grappling with the issue of what will be the future of higher education. Will it be a hybrid model of both teleeducation and also physical? Will we return to traditional educational models? But huge innovation is underway in the immediate response to the pandemic. Now, going forward, of course, the holy grail, and there's work all over the world, is about, getting a safe vaccine ready to be deployed on a global scale. And it's very exciting to see the many partnerships that have emerged very quickly in the world among the best researchers in universities and national labs, and of course, companies as we move forward with the vaccine. But during this time as well, we've seen a lot of innovation in how experts, epidemiologists have taken existing medicines and capabilities and put them in new combinations to deal with responding to a virus whose characteristics have been very mysterious in spite of its genomic sequencing. So innovation on the vaccine front is huge. But I will also mention innovation, of course, in overall global business. Supply chains were extremely disrupted, but also the vulnerabilities were exposed in a very, very, again, stark way. In the United States, it was truly a shock to our nation and to our economy and to our people to realize the extent of which the global supply chains for critical pharmaceuticals, for medical devices, for PPA had all been hollowed out, and we were extremely dependent on China in particular through these supply chains. So we're seeing now a rapid move to reinvent, restart, and ensure resiliency in global supply chains. And I know we'll hear about this from Professor Hamaguchi as well. And finally, I'll mention on the innovation front, the promise of using modeling and simulation tools, high performance computing, to actually at huge scale model and simulate the behavior of this virus and others, to use these tools to develop new predictive capability for tracking, for monitoring, for ensuring in the next pandemic, and there will certainly be one, we will have a much better capability to understand, respond, and ensure that we could mitigate in order to protect people's lives, but also the functioning of our economy. And we're very excited in the United States that a number of our corporations have joined with our national laboratories and universities under the mantle of the Department of Energy for a massive public-private partnership to use the power and promise of high performance computing across many fronts of innovation in dealing with the pandemic now and in the future. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Roberto. I know we're going to have a very robust discussion on innovation, but innovation is occurring across every dimension of life, society, and business, as well as at the frontiers of research.
Thank you, Deborah. And thanks for reminding us of some of the things already happening, developments in telemedicine, online education, but also some of the things that we need to address going forward. Hamaguchi-san, you have been leading Japan Science and Technology. You launched the Hamaguchi Plan, and you've been working to create, to design, and support the deployment of Society for 5.0 in Japan. So, and then the pandemic comes, right? Yes. So over to you, sir. How those things change transformation, and what are the things that are being accelerated? How are you reacting? Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Let me express my heartfelt thanks to the GFCC for inviting me to this online conversation series, and also express my great sympathy for those still suffering the effect of the pandemic. The GFCC is doing a wonderful job by giving us this new platform to exchange ideas and make progress despite the difficulty of the situation. In response to today's topic, yes, our economy and society will surely benefit from post-crisis innovation. Today, I would like to discuss our post-crisis society and how we design a new normal from now on. The keyword which I would like to explore today is accommodation. In medical practice, informed consent is an extremely important concept. The doctor's role is to provide the patient with sufficient knowledge to make their own decisions. The patient is both enabled and accommodated. And similarly, in response to the crisis like COVID-19, and in post-crisis society, we must accommodate rather than suppress individual freedoms so as not to hedge people's free thought. This is important not only for overcoming COVID-19, but pursuing well-being of us. Unfortunately, in some areas around the Asian countries, we are seeing more strict use of face recognition cameras, biometric sensors, and other tracking technologies that is being used to limit freedom of movement. However, I believe the tendency toward totalitarian regime style, surveillance, and nationalist isolations, as forewarned by Dr. Harari, Israeli historian, he said, these will ultimately suppress people's free thought, creativity, and also, of course, innovation. In Japan, we have fortunately avoided such measures, yet the death rate still remains relatively low. Somehow mysterious outcomes right now. This might be attributed to factors including our existing common practice of wearing masks and frequently washing hands, as well as equity and stability of our medical system. However, these factors need further studies. Yet, even Japanese mysterious success in limited number of the coronavirus deaths right now could be in part thanks to an accommodation approach. The government requested, not forced, a voluntary restriction on outing and tried to avoid overwhelming hospitals by concentrating resources on clustering intervention, tolerating some leakage or capture. Citizens were informed of the risk and the most effective methods to prevent the spread of infection, but not forced into action. By being given responsibilities, citizens have acted with responsibility and forwarded and suggested guidelines, making these own decisions while being mindful of the effect on others. However, Japan might be a lucky case. We have a population that is still relatively homogeneous, both ethically and culturally, with a strong sense of shared values. In more multicultural societies with larger range of personal and community values, it will be a greater challenge to accommodate such diversity and align everyone toward achieving common social good. I'm brought back to the word of late Dr. Tetsu Nakamura, who dedicated his life to improving living standards in Afghanistan. He said, the fundamental human need is 3 meals per day at home with family. This is a core requirement for well-being. Despite difficulties in individual values, perhaps fundamental human needs are not so different. I'm sure working from home has allowed many of you to reassess what is really important to you. So let's start with this common denominator and together create a set of shared values. Let's accommodate and empower each other and build a global well-being envisioning post-crisis society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hamaguchi-san, and for highlighting this human aspect of the crisis and the things that we need to really enhance and prioritize going forward. I will leave one question for you to answer later in the conversation, that it's really about the priorities in terms of research and technology investment, and how are you seeing those change because of the current situation. But I'll leave that in the air, and then it would be great if you could address later. Chad, you are working with Deborah and other leaders in the United States, and even before the pandemic, you were thinking about the future of innovation systems, working with leaders and reimagining, redesigning that. So what could you share about the things that you are doing, and maybe some of the components that have emerged because of the current situation? Wonderful to have you here, my friend.
Great to see you, Roberto. Thank you, Deborah. Thanks to my fellow panelists, and for everyone who's watching. It's great to be with all of you, colleagues, old and new. Well, where to begin? You set an ambitious agenda for us, Roberto, but so why don't I maybe start with a snapshot of America today? You know, this morning I'm sitting in the capital of the world's most successful and economically competitive nation on the planet ever. And yet we find there's a burning need to accelerate competitiveness, to accelerate innovation that underpins long-term productivity and inclusive prosperity, but in a new way. And why do I say that? Well, as we've entered the third decade of the 21st century, shaken, as Deborah mentioned in her opening remarks, by a global pandemic that has, in the United States alone, claimed more than 123,000 lives and wiped away in just months over 50 million jobs, we clearly face a new imperative to accelerate innovation across all levels of American society. We need a massive culture change, one that is embracing technological innovation and its advancement in all parts of our society. So here's where we are today. I'm going to give you, and Roberto, I've trademarked this so you can't take it, America's Innovation and Competitiveness Barometer. So let's take a look at, let's say, the 330 million Americans living and working today, driving our ideas-rich $20 trillion economy. And let's break that 333 million into 3 groups of 110 million by income. First, for the top 110 million, we see no negative indicators. Lifespans are approaching and surpassing 90 years of age. Education and attainment levels are accelerating. Incomes are accelerating. Wealth generation is accelerating at unprecedented rates. This 120 million Americans are the inheritors, the beneficiaries of America's 20th century innovation engine. Now, let's look at the middle 110 million. For these citizens, most of the relevant indicators that I just mentioned are either flat, even declining slightly. Now, for the lower 110 million, there are 0 positive indicators. Lifespans, down. Educational attainment, down. Income gains, wealth generation, down. Therefore, in the United States, we have a range of issues that are demanding massively distributed, inclusive, diverse innovation for a subset of our population that is detached from our nation's prodigious innovation engine. That's more than 200 million Americans. That's larger than the combined populations of Japan and Germany, detached from the innovation engine. So what are we doing about that? The Council on Competitiveness, as you mentioned, and as Deborah noted, launched this year a national commission on innovation and competitiveness frontiers. We have over 60 CEOs, including, you mentioned Brian Moynihan from Bank of America, Janet Foudy from Deloitte, Mahmood Khan, former global vice chair of Pepsi, now CEO of Life Biosciences, and many others joining with university presidents, labor leaders, and national lab directors, and supported by an even larger community of over 200 innovation thought leaders and stakeholders from every corner of the country, all working together to define a private sector-driven innovation agenda for the nation. As Michael Crow, our vice chairman from Arizona State, says, it's a modernization model. We have to be unbelievably creative in reinventing America for what we're calling the next economy. Our commissioners met virtually just last week to review the progress we've made since we launched in January at Arizona State. That progress includes a compilation and a synthesis of nearly 50 mini conferences that we held virtually over an 8-week period once COVID-19 shut us down. So we were innovating in real time these hundreds of leaders across the country, across work streams, 3 working groups, to begin creating that transformational, actionable innovation policy agenda, targeted, yes, for the administration, for our Congress, for our governors and state leaders, but also for the private sector itself. These 3 working groups just quickly are, how do we develop and deploy disruptive technology at scale? How do we explore the future of sustainable production, consumption, and work? And how do we optimize our environment for multiple innovation systems across the country, not just Silicon Valley and Route 128 and the Research Triangle? And in just a few short months, we have developed in this multi-dimensional process 9 priority pillars on which we will build our 2020 innovation call to action. Those 9 pillars, really quickly. First, COVID-19, the virus economy, and our need to strengthen U.S. resiliency. As Deborah mentioned, we've become overly reliant on efficiency, and we need to focus more on resiliency. 2, assessing our U.S. capabilities of strategic and critical technologies. 3, we have to confront the rise of China as a U.S. technological, national security, economic, and geopolitical competitor. 4, we have to eliminate the valleys of death, and actually get rid of that term, we hate it, but we have to eliminate the valleys of death in the U.S. innovation system. 5, we've got to optimize the role that our universities and our national laboratories play in technology transfer, commercialization, and engagement with the private sector. 6, we have to double down on business sustainability efforts. 7, we have to expand access to technology-driven industrial and economic opportunity in regional innovation hubs around the country. 8, we have to build inclusiveness and diversity into the pipeline of the U.S. innovators and our entrepreneurial class. And then 9, we have to prepare the American workforce for a rapidly changing high-skill economy. Now, that was a lot, and I'm happy to go deeper on any of those. But the feedback from our commissioners on this first slate of priorities was resoundingly positive. Our commissioners have also emphasized, and I'd like to share this with everyone, a couple of other key points as they're thinking about how do we transform the U.S. innovation system. One, this is an historic moment for the United States, and the timing for our commission's findings is perhaps unique, as they are likely to be one of the first, if not the first, national report on innovation in a post-COVID world. Let's hope for post-COVID. Two, our country is not as competitive as possible. Progress has lagged because we have failed to address social and economic inequalities. And the lack of inclusion and access of opportunity for many Americans, especially women and racial and ethnic minorities, who, by the way, have been really hit hard in the COVID-19 world. This is a competitiveness inhibitor. Third, the United States has paid this heavy price as the pandemic, as Deborah mentioned, exposed a dangerous lack of resiliency and supply chain fragility. And we have to correct that now. And then finally, and I'll end on this point, the rules of engagement have changed. Our economic transition and massive expansion of the 20th century has reached its end. It's over. The rest of the world has risen. This created a much more complex global economic landscape, and our commission's recommendations will be aimed at responding to this transformed competitive environment. Incremental, conventional thinking will not get us where we need to be. And I think as someone wrote just recently in MIT Tech Review, we have to consider the 1990s as the dark age. What worked then will not work in 2020, much less 2025 or 2050.
Thank you, Chad. I think you are working across sectors in America, right? And I think in a nutshell, what you highlighted to me is in the next economy, innovation for all. So, and we'll be back for that. So thank you for that. Jenna, you are also working across sectors in Brazil, coming from business or the business sector and addressing national frameworks and policies to drive innovation. How is it going? How is it being affected by the situation we're living through?
Okay. Good morning. I would like to thank you, GFCC, for inviting me to participate in this great initiative. We are partners, but more than that, we admire your work, connecting knowledge, brilliant people, great institutions all over the world. I also would like to highlight the leadership of Deborah Winston-Smith, in whom I am inspired to develop my work. Chad and Roberto, in addition, are great friends and amazing work colleagues. So, from Brazilian perspective, I believe that the pandemic showed that more than ever, the importance of public policies and government's priorities to innovation. I would say for the whole sector of science, technology, and innovation. This is crucial to stimulate our companies, the investment of our companies, and also the economy. As you know, CNI, that is the Brazilian Confederation of Industries, we coordinate the MEI, that is the Brazilian business mobilization to foster innovation in Brazil. Now we have more than 300 enterprise, big leaders from the biggest enterprises in Brazil, but also authorities and representatives from the Brazilian government, from the legislative, from the executive, also from the academia, institutes of science, technology. So we believe that from the Brazilian perspective, we need to give priority for this area. And also, we believe that this will be the only vector that will allow us to develop our country and to create prosperity. I would also say that beyond product innovation, organizational innovation will be very critical for public and private sectors. Learning how to deal with foresight tools and reacting promptly may be more important than just having technologies. Also, We are living very hard times, but I strongly believe this generation is also having an unparalleled opportunity to rebuild the humanities basis. I've always worked for the progress of science, technology, innovation, and education. And it has never been so easy to make people understand that any successful development strategy, it doesn't matter if it's for a country or a company, will necessarily be based on knowledge, and that investment on people should always be a priority. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shanna. And I think that you just mentioned opportunity. So, and I will leave a question for everybody here for us. What are the opportunities? What are the verticals, the industries, the areas, the priorities? But I'll leave that. We can get back to that point. Jim, thanks for joining us. I know it's late night in New Zealand, and you've been working in the research space, technology space, but you also are a university leader. I think one of the things that we're seeing here, Deborah mentioned in the beginning, and we've seen that throughout the conversation, is that universities are being heavily impacted by this current situation. Going online, coming, let's say, blended education, lots of things happening. So what's your take? How is innovation changing and affecting not just higher education, but other aspects?
Thank you, Roberto, and thank you to Deborah and the GFCC for hosting these series of discussions. It is actually very useful to be able to share experience across the world in what are extremely difficult times. New Zealand, in terms of our context, we're a small 5 million, a nation of 5 million people. We are a trading nation with very long supply chains, as Deborah has mentioned, and we're far from our markets. The transition for us in terms of the COVID experience has been probably rather different to some parts of the world. We went into lockdown relatively early, in the middle of March. The university moved online within about a week, educating 44,000 students, the University of Auckland. And we did that on the back of already having shifted most of our student-facing support functions onto digital platforms, onto the cloud, basically. So that worked very successfully. And the only caveat I would add is that the people who had the most difficult transition were, of course, the people who were already disadvantaged groups. They were the ones who did not have good access to internet, who did not have good technology. So what we find is that these experiences, these disruptors, do magnify disadvantage, most certainly. And that's one of the things that we've had to address. New Zealand has had 22 deaths and is now COVID-free, in the sense that there is no community transmission within New Zealand. As far as we are aware, there are 11 cases in quarantine in the hotels commandeered as quarantine centres at the border, but it has really focused the attention of New Zealand on what the border means, because that has become our line of defence. But what you also observe is that being COVID-free and having a closed border does in no way mitigate the economic damage that the COVID experience has caused. So we are really looking at then what next for a country which has been very successful. And I would comment in response to some of Deborah's comments that the person leading the government response to this remarked to me that this was the most data-rich crisis that the world has ever faced. And in fact, it is the use and interpretation of that data which has very much helped New Zealand into the position that it is in now. Most of the expert advice came out of our universities. But we also had a government who were prepared to engage and discuss and argue and contest and use that advice. But as I said, that has not helped us in terms of where we go next, because what we find is that, as something that Chad mentioned as well, the emphasis has shifted from the efficiency of our economy to the resilience of our economy, and we have not been particularly resilient. We have a country which is largely dependent on things like tourism and primary production, and the industries which have been most resilient are those which sit on digital platforms, and that is at the opposite end of the spectrum from where most of our economy is concentrated. So we have a pretty major challenge to deal with, and that is how we shift basically the resilience and diversity of our economy to a far more resilient place than where it is at the moment. The initial stimulus packages that the government has used very much address restoring the old economy as quickly as possible. The preservation of jobs is very much the focus. What we have not had yet is the thinking about what we're going to do differently to shift the axis of the economy. The universities, of course, have a very central role in that, in driving that innovation agenda. And I think one of the very positive things in the New Zealand case is that we've gone through an increase in confidence of the people in their government and in their universities and in their research system, which has supported this. So those are positives that we can use in terms of reimagining the future, because we're at the stage now where we're probably ahead of the curve in terms of where many countries are in dealing with COVID, but we are nowhere near dealing with what comes next. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks for reminding us. As you said, New Zealand has this particular case. You can be COVID-free, but you cannot be free of the economic impacts of that. But you also mentioned something that really connects to one of the questions that came up here from our distinguished fellow, Rick Parker, that's to use the stimulus packages to get back to the old economy or to build a new economy. And talking about a new economy, you also mentioned digital platforms. And I think we could hardly find someone better to talk about that than Betty Young. Betty, actually, 500 Startups, your company, was one of the first to make an assessment on how investors around the globe are reacting, especially in terms of venture capital investment because of this crisis. So over to you, Betty. How is innovation, how is investment changing on the new things because of the situation and going forward?
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the invitation to join this panel. It's fascinating to hear what's happening around the world, and we have this coverage between New Zealand, Japan, US, Brazil, and being able to really come together. And I think a lot of the innovation that we see, it's really at this intersection point of different stakeholders and voices. So today, definitely we have not only the geography component and also where each of us sort of represent within, whether it's public or private or often like university side. So very, very excited this morning, afternoon, and even depending where you are, because it's such a global panel, and I'm sure also the audience to be here. So thinking from a venture perspective and a little bit of like the angle of innovation that I'm speaking about, I'm talking about the innovation often from startups. So it's framed into a very specific context. It's companies that maybe doesn't exist yet, and they are in formation today to create and disrupt and construct the opportunities, because I think COVID has disrupted the market. Now it's how do we build opportunities to build a better sort of future, to build a better society around that. So I work really, really closely with thousands of entrepreneurs. So we have invested in over 2,000 companies, and that gives us a lot of that mindset of starting a business and how to be agile and how to look at the opportunities and build through the technology sort of solutions around that. So we've seen that sort of being created over and over. So there's so much money going into venture capital. So last year, over 140 billion was raised just last year, and year over year, that amount is increasing. So imagine that amount of money, and most of the venture capitalists, including myself, often think we want to chase innovation, want to chase like the next technology, but this is a really important moment for us to shape and participate in what we can think of what the next 5, 10, 20, 100 years would then look like. So I think looking at a very micro level of what's happening in the startup world and all this sort of pandemic situation is that millions of people are being currently unemployed. And at the same time, small, medium business, many of them are shutting down, right? So if we can only balance in the micro level, 3 levels of very important components, I think we can start thinking maybe that's an interesting framework for early stage startups or people reconstructing towards the future. So the 3 components, first is capital, and I can speak a little more about the capital, which can be the venture capital, can be the loan that is being injected into the recovery and the resiliency of that market. So the first one is capital. The second is the stability of the market. It's very difficult for me to start a business or start a startup if I don't know if the market is there. And right now, everyone is holding back for the consumption. Everyone's holding back for what's happening. So if we can find ways to facilitate and connect the markets for consumption, for demand, I believe that's a second very, very important component. And then the third one is the talent. Sometimes we need reskilling and education so that they can really capture, because as many of you have mentioned before, this is also a time where maybe because you don't have access to a certain network, you're disadvantaged, therefore you are all at the same time not being able to access any of those 3 components. And by putting those 3 components together, actually you can really create really amazing startups that later on can capture a lot of the value. And that's the same thing, I believe, for small, medium business in restaurants, right? So if we go into restaurants, if I know that I can reopen the restaurants because I know the demand is there, and then I have some loan to restart, things can whether sort of come back to new normal. So I think those are some of the frameworks that I think it's really important and we apply. So for instance, we work very, very closely what we call the acceleration program, which is at the same time giving founders those 3 components, right? We give them capital. So we're investing in those startups with 150,000, very small amount of capital to just get them started. We try to connect what we call growth marketing and access to different markets, especially that now the markets are becoming ever more connected and digitalized. So that's sort of a second component. And then there's a very, very important component, which is access to education and networks to facilitate really that component. So if we take those 3 components and we can look at how do we take this to a much larger scale, that's something that we believe it can be transformational. I also believe many of us have discussed the resiliency of the countries and the competitiveness of potential countries. It's really interesting. I spend most of my time, although today I've been in Miami, sort of locked down, but I spend most of my time in Silicon Valley. So very often we're talking about potentially cities or regions where innovation is happening. But I think there's this sort of real shift today amongst potentially where innovation can happen if we can inject those 3 components that I mentioned, because at the end of the day, talent, it's everywhere. So we believe that by creating the condition in those early stages that actually allow a lot of flourishment of the innovation that could happen. When you look at not in the early stage, but you go into all the way to the public markets, you can like really list today the top 5 largest market cap companies are all sort of tech companies, right? So looking from that angle, I believe that we will be, during this crisis time, really finding and shaping and being able to contribute to the journey of many, many entrepreneurs that are coming. So just a few things on the trends that we are seeing, and I know we might cover a little bit later with the rest of panelists. So Deborah mentioned some of the key activities that we've seen on investments, right? So because we are at the healthcare crisis, we see so many health tech companies that are sometimes pivoting to look at how they really help solve this current situation. The second big one that we've seen a lot of activities are around education tech, especially it's not concentrated, there's a lot of language component, right? So very often we've seen like very large platforms like in English, but like we are seeing some of our portfolio like really growing in like Spanish speaking, Arabic speaking, and then also in Asia, that's like very sort of relevant to think about the component of education tech, definitely on supply chain. I would add two more sectors that we can discuss sort of further. One is the fintech one. That's not a new sector, but the lending, later the collection of those debts, the way that the capital is being moved. So when the government decided to deploy the loans to the end, to the edges, the network wasn't built. So there's really like a lot of components around fintech that we see a lot of movement and will continue to see that growth. And then the fifth area, it's a little bit of what I've seen as a signal and a little bit of a trend is around ESG investments, which are very often today capital is not the most restrictive factor that's there, but can we use and allocate capital in a way that is creating environmental and also societal changes around that. So I think there is this consciousness that is bringing us during this time that Hamaguchi-san like mentioned really well, the human component of that, it's here, and I think it's here to stay. So applying that to the capital with that angle in the multiple level, whether you're early stage or later stage, looking at innovation, I think it's a very good way for us to like really reimagine and be able to deploy the capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. And I think that one of the aspects that you brought here is in order not just to react, but to transition, we need to make resources available to entrepreneurs and to communities around the globe, but also the possibility to decouple that from geography to a certain extent, right? Creating more like access throughout the world. So just maybe Deborah could turn to you for your reaction. We could see if anyone, we got some questions here, but if any of you want to make a question, please go to the Q&A here and share that with you. Deborah, any comments or questions at this point?
I just want to thank everyone for their outstanding interventions, and we've learned tremendously the different experiences and what's going on in terms of moving forward, but also, you know, these challenges of how we're really facing with a design of a new world. And at the same time, you know, we want to have collaboration, integration, but we're also seeing some decoupling as well and some deglobalization. And so this is going to be a very challenging future to navigate. And I think I'll highlight Hamaguchi's comments about shared values and also the human element of this, because I think we will see deeper integration among those countries that do have shared values and shared narratives for the future. And that will not just be in science and technology, but it's going to be also in supply chains. It's going to be in national security as well. So that's, and then of course, the other thing that came out very, very importantly in this discussion, and my colleague Chad Evans mentioned it, you know, it's the US's example. We really have to and I'll say in the case of the United States, take advantage of our home team. You know, the fact that we have such a large percentage of our population that is not included and participating in the innovation future has to be dealt with. And it's not something, you know, that we're talking about 20 years into the future. And I'll just give an example. You know, you think of all the universities in this country that have massive endowments, and you know, they really don't like to spend their endowments. Some of these universities have billions and billions of dollars. I see Betty laughing. But you know, there needs to be a massive push now to prepare and have underrepresented groups being educated at scale in the United States to fully participate. And you know, the days are over of saying, well, you know, they're not qualified or this or that. I think if you look at a country like China that's done a superb job in educating its people at scale, there's no reason in the world why the United States and Brazil and other countries can't really do that for our own populations, because otherwise it's more than an equity and social issue. It's a very deep competitive disadvantage.
Innovation for all. Thank you, Deborah. Chad, over to you. But when I transition to you, just let me put one question that came here that's about the next steps for the commission. Maybe you could address that, but also tee you up and the other speakers, Jean, Gianna, Hamaguchi-san, on maybe opportunities that you are seeing in terms of areas.
Yeah, I'm going to give you really 3 broad categories, but this is based on research from the council that we conducted with Gallup, a major piece of work called No Recovery. That report documented the structural decline of US productivity over a 50-year period. And it pointed to 3 major sectors as the cause of that decline: healthcare, housing, education. Those are the opportunity spaces. In 1980, those 3 sectors accounted for 25% of total spending in the United States. Today, they account for nearly 40% of total national spend in the United States. And yet, over that time period, between 1980 and today, there has been next to 0 productivity growth in those sectors. That is ripe for massive disruption and innovation. I'll stop there. On the next steps for our commission, in December, we will release a year 1 call to action for the nation. This is a multi-year effort. It is involving, as I mentioned, several hundred people in multiple working groups. Those will grow and evolve. And I would like to, obviously, Deborah and I want to invite others to join and participate in helping us think about and create that innovation agenda. So I'm happy to talk more about that. But the immediate next steps, at least for, I will say, the next 6 months, is building that agenda. Our working groups meet nearly daily in a virtual setting, much like this. It's an intense process, but while December is a major point in time for us, especially with a transition, whether it remains the Trump administration in version 2.0, or we have a new administration, there will be a massive change in the United States in either way. And we will be prepared to deploy and continue with our commission and with our working groups in our year 2 effort.
Thanks, Chad. Maybe Hamaguchi-san, Gianna, Jim, any comments on priorities and opportunity areas? Jim, I noticed that you were ready to talk about that.
Right?
Yeah, Hamaguchi-san, yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, to be honest, our society, Japan, has some defect that we realized by the COVID-19. One is a digital transformation. Japan is still behind most of the world. We need complete digital transformation in our system. Second is education. We realized we lacked continuous support for the talented young researchers. So we started a new project to support talented researcher around 30 to 40 for 10 years grant. It's a long-term grant to find out ambitious, innovative researchers in our society. Third, we are now thinking about is a big project that encourage people, researchers to find the way to improve our system, our society. This we call moonshot project. We focus on 2040 to 2050. At the time, we are discussing what kind of technology we need at the time. And now we are on the way to select challenging researchers for this big project. This kind of arrangement, I think we can facilitate to change our society system and the research system to new normal situation. And key word is digital transformation. We need it. Thank you. Is it okay?
Thank you, Hamaguchi-san. Maybe going further down the road, we could explore more about this moonshot initiative. It's something that we worked in the GFCC, and we were happy to have you with us back in 2017 in Kuala Lumpur when we were talking about that. I'll leave it here for the moment. Maybe we could explore it in a minute. So Gianna and Jim, on priorities and opportunities that you see for innovation going forward.
I mean, one of the issues which we face is that in the budget, we see investment in what I would call the old economy, despite openly acknowledging that many areas of that economy actually will never recover. What New Zealand, and it was very interested in Chad's comments, because New Zealand has a persistent productivity deficit challenge. And that really is a major part of the lack of resilience of our economy when we face a massive disruption such as COVID. The digital transformation, which has been mentioned by a number of speakers, similarly is massively important to us. Also, what's massively important is the nature of our education system and the type of graduates that our universities produce. Because we have had a very traditional and a very classical educational model, which doesn't actually serve well the need to be rapidly responsive, the need for retraining, re-education, for driving innovation, entrepreneurship. And so what we need is to incorporate far more of that thinking into the type of graduates that our education system produces.
And Jing, just let me build on that, because we also have a question here coming from Argentina from our good friend Juan Pedro Corica. What are the models that you see to really to retune education and to create this type of solution that you mentioned, to upskill, to reskill people, but also to train young professionals? What are some of the new models that you are seeing that you believe could be promising?
One of the things in defense of our current universities, I would say that COVID has reached into many parts of the university. It is not the modelers and the medics. It is also very much the social scientists, the psychologists who have informed the response across New Zealand. So we need that breadth of skills. What we also need is the ability to work across disciplines much more effectively than the current models of universities allow us to do. So I think that certainly is an innovation which we need to drive much harder. Is, you know, they always say an academic's first allegiance is to their discipline, their second allegiance is to their university, and it goes. And what we need to do is actually change that mindset significantly.
Thank you, Jim. Gianna, over to you on priorities and opportunities that you're seeing to drive innovation in Brazil going forward. And also, if you want to comment on, reflect on the skilling or reskilling topic. But over to you, Gianna.
Yeah, thank you. Well, there is no doubt that everything in digital area is promising. All the tools to remote work in different sectors and contactless technologies will be on top of demand. But thinking on policy side, I believe there are emerging innovation opportunities to help countries improve their governance structures to face crises such as the ones we are going through. Despite all the difficulties we are fighting against here in Brazil, our healthcare system, for example, is certainly a model to be improved and replicated in other countries. As the crisis advances, we see significant transformation in social behavior, with people thinking about and looking for purpose in every aspect of their lives. Because of that, it's probably that the transition to renewables will be accelerated, that social impact will mean much more to every consumer, and that technologies allowing us to track the production of goods from very beginning in the value chain will grow a lot. Green and circular economy business will ramp up as it is happening in the digital world. And many technologies are already available, but we will see much more interest and urgency in the adoption in these areas.
I was muted here. Thank you, Gianna. So you highlighted things that are at the same time related to the response healthcare technology, but also going forward like renewables. But you brought a different aspect to this conversation, that's government tech or GovTech and solutions to improve that. Maybe Chad and Betty, I could turn to you maybe for your reflection on this thing about the skills. You, Chad, are working with that in the commission, as you mentioned, right? How to develop future skills in the U.S. economy. And Betty, you brought this aspect about preparing entrepreneurs, preparing innovation ecosystems. What are some of the solutions that you are seeing to do that at the speed that's needed? Chad, over to you on the whole reskilling, upskilling component.
Sorry, Roberto, I was on mute. Yeah, it's a huge issue. And in fact, one of the reasons to bring together this community across the United States is that there are many best practices that are helping some areas and regions do better than others. I'm going to give you one example of something we have discovered in some of our research, some of our engagement with our members across the country, that is a model that we have proposed and promoted that ought to be scaled and replicated across the United States. Deborah will know this story very well because she was with me. We had a project about 2 years ago. In fact, this project was the genesis of our National Commission. It was an NSF, National Science Foundation sponsored project called Exploring Innovation Frontiers. And we were traveling the country trying to capture best practices to turbocharge innovation capabilities and capacities. And we were struck in one of our dialogues that took place in California, University of California, Riverside, which has a tremendous track record in not only attracting women and minorities into undergraduate and then ultimately graduate programs, but in retaining, mentoring. They've done this incredible job. They outperform not only the UC system, but the colleges across the United States. So what did they do? Well, they discovered really rapidly, and in fact, they learned a little bit of this from the University of Georgia, where the program actually was birthed, that you had to engage students from day one and expose them to the most exciting people, researchers, teachers, but also the tools, research tools, laboratories, and capture their attention within the first 3 hours of stepping onto that campus, and then guide them along that pipeline, never letting go, encouraging and integrating them very intimately into deep research very early, because it is that capture moment that matters. And then, of course, the retention. Now, of course, we'd like to do that much sooner in the pipeline. This would be very important to do in the K through 12 system, even before someone goes to a community college or a university. But this model at UC Riverside, and it's obviously up on their website, and I can share more from our own report on the Exploring Innovation Frontiers effort, is a real best practice. And how do you think about skilling and retaining that talent? But there are other examples, and Deborah will know more. For example, a system in the US that does a really good job in skills development and mentoring and cultivation are our military academies. I should probably leave it to Deborah to talk about the Naval Academy, given her experience with her family. But these are also benchmarks and the ability to integrate not only deep learning around engineering, but coupled to complex social sciences issues, leadership, global exposure. So, these are, and there's no reason that these models can't be replicated across the country. They just haven't. And so part of our job at the Council on Competitiveness and part of our commission is to find ways to help scale programs like this.
Thank you, Chad. Deborah, you were mentioned, so I'll turn to you in a minute. Thanks for sharing that, Chad. Betty, on upskilling, reskilling, you raised that. What are the models that you are seeing across the globe, where you operate across geographies, that you think we should highlight?
Yeah, so the acceleration program, for instance, that we run, we look at that as a way to set the founders with the right skills to be successful in those early days, right? So like they come in, they get accelerated in their journey. And we normally start very, very early in the pipeline. Very often it's not in their age, but very often it's first-time founders. So we have seen, for instance, amazing cases from founders that they are very, very successful in their journey. For instance, like an example is these two founders that were at the university in Portugal. When after the graduation, they came to the program. Now they built this business called Talkdesk that is valued over $2 billion. So it's very difficult to imagine how two researchers that are at school, how can they build something in such a short time frame, right? It's like definitely less than 10 years. And one of the co-founder, Christina today, she then set up her fund and then she's been investing in that. So there is sometimes thinking at, if we can come in at a very early stage to provide the curriculum, the mentorship to the founders, what does the full life cycle looks like? Like after they become successful, other people that really open people's imagination. If someone that lives in my country, live in my city, can build something like that, it really opens people's imagination. So I think a lot of the components when we are thinking about reskilling and the education component is creating this space for possibility. It's very difficult to see or imagine what you've never seen. So we are trying to anticipate and build that. I think there's also a second component really important around education, and the way that we're framing is what got us here is not gonna get us there. So there's a lot of sort of innovation component we're trying to drive around that. Definitely the pedagogical component, the methodology, the playbooks can be written, should be shared. But I think most importantly, I think it's building this network of mentors that is always one step ahead to see what is the next growth hacking, what is the next marketing campaign that would work, and then they build that back into the system, right? So it's this sort of almost learning machine that should sort of be set in place. So programs like this, we've done it over 50 times. We started in Silicon Valley, and then some like interesting examples. We did end of last year, for instance, in partnership with UNDP to look at the impact component and training in Indonesia, because definitely Southeast Asia is one of that key markets. Another very interesting programs that we just launched yesterday. It's a COVID-19 program that we're establishing in partnership with the mayor of Kobe City in Japan. And a lot of it is looking at their healthcare cluster and how do we integrate the talent to that local market and like really enable innovation in that sort of partnership component. So a lot of what we've seen is how can we take this methodology, this network that we have in all different parts and really open this up to, I think it should be like millions of founders. And with the technology now, we used to have to like go run like a program in Indonesia, go run a program in like Georgia, but the country of Georgia, not the state of Georgia, because we also run programs there, for instance, like in partnership with the government and the World Bank. Instead of like traveling there, now a lot of those content really can be accessed online. So I think just overall, very interesting to see where education is moving. And a lot of it might be also moving out of the traditional institutions.
Perfect. So your point coincides with what Chad has just highlighted, earliness in the process in different contexts. Deborah, over to you. And I think that I mentioned that to you. I personally believe that the military is a big strength in the United States, not just because the military itself, but because this amazing skills development machine. And Chad raised that point too. Any thoughts that you would like to share, Deborah?
Well, I'll just briefly comment on that, and then I wanted to ask a question to my colleagues. But I think what's powerful about the educational system in the military academies is that they're really developing ethical leaders, and it's about leadership. And they don't ascribe to the view that you're born a leader and it's something in your DNA. They really see the potential in everyone to have, leadership capability as long as it's nurtured. But what they do that's very powerful is, of course, they recognize and always have that you have to have a grounding in the core STEM disciplines. And that's really almost a baseline. That's just sort of table stakes. But on top of that is this deep, deep infusion of the social sciences, the humanities, philosophy, all the things that enable a leader to understand what it means to be a human and ethical leader in the context of global cultures and civilizations. And I'll just share one example. I won't mention the university in the United States, but it's one of our preeminent engineering universities. And I gave a big talk there last year for one of their major anniversaries and on innovation. And I was using the example of innovation, in other ways of thinking, not just in science and technology and engineering, and talked about Herodotus, as being a tremendous innovator because he was the first that we know of. And I may express ignorance here, but at least for me being a classical archaeologist, he was really the first human that we know of that stepped outside of his culture to be an anthropologist and to look at different societies, to understand why they were different, and to begin, to create what we call the discipline of history. And so when I made that comment, and I just said there were about 200 people in the room, researchers, students, all, heavy STEM, it was engineering. I said, how many of you have read Herodotus' histories? No one raised their hand. And then what was really scary to me was I said, well, how many of you know who Herodotus is? Not one person raised their hand. And to me, that was such a stark realization that we are not educating the fusion of the disciplines and the knowledge that enable us to be, human beings at the extreme limit of our ability. So that's just, something I wanted to comment on. But if we have time, I'd really love Betty to give us a little bit of a perspective on where she thinks the real innovation, next generation innovation clusters are emerging in the United States, because she's doing things all over the world and she's mentioned a few, but where are you seeing the potential in the United States, and how are you dealing with that, particularly around the areas of equity and parts of the country that have been decimated, with the change in manufacturing and things. And I know you're not going to say, well, you have to be in Silicon Valley or you have to be in Boston, because you're all over the world. So I want to hear where you're going to be in the US, and we'd love to work with you on that.
Over to you.
Yeah. So one thing that we believe actually is going to move a little bit out of the coast, although we often think the coast, Silicon Valley and New York being definitely the main two clusters that we've seen. In the current situation, for instance, like Austin and Seattle and Boston, and also the recent clusters that we see a lot of entrepreneurs. But actually, what we believe in the approach and the framework is actually many of the cities and states can actually raise their own cluster. What I think is really important is think about the verticalization and what makes them really competitive. So looking at their natural current resources that they have, and then really build on top of that. So for instance, although Miami is in the coast, there's a very large Latino community here. So we've been working very closely with the Downtown Development Agency that is working a lot around development to see how do we work with like creating opportunities for founders here. And we've seen a lot of the success now that we've been here for 3 years. And most recently, I've also been really impressed working with Arizona, because I think there's a lot of the right mindset sort of going in. So I believe a lot of clusters are yet to be created. And right now, I wouldn't say it's definitely in any of the coastal cities, but I think it's very important to develop a plan for what 2030 looks like in those states and cities throughout the United States. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, for instance, thinking of any of the industry, we've have conversation around, for instance, agriculture tech, supply chain, automotive, looking at mobility. So I don't think it's gonna be only one. I think the question is, how can you be one of the top in that sector that all the talent would go through, and it will continue to create a lot of value on the ground?
Building on that, your question and what you just said, Betty, let's go for a final round here. We're approaching our time limit. So when you make your final remarks, maybe if you could think or reflect on the things that are emerging, as Deborah mentioned, what's next, and what are some of the how is even innovation changing? And Hamaguchi-san, when you think about that, if you could comment about the Moonshot initiative that you are driving in Japan. So who would like to go first for this final round? Say, Gianna, you? Okay, over to you, Gianna.
Thank you, Roberto. I just would like to mention Brazil. We have a green matrix, an expressive research on renewables, which is a more important asset from now on. In agriculture, the combination of bio and digital techs will define our growth and hopefully push our economy. Finally, in the health sector, thanks to our accomplishments in tropical diseases and tests like fighting Zika virus, we will probably do a good job and give our contribution to the treatment and development of a vaccine for coronavirus. So I just would like to give you some a good point of view from Brazil that we are fighting and that we hope to contribute to our development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gianna. Bio, digital tech to build a green economy. Thanks for sharing that. Yes. Hamaguchi-san.
Yeah, just so I want to mention about our Moonshot program. Among multiple Moonshot programs, we have one program called Millennium Project. In this project, we encourage women researchers, young researchers, to form a small group to apply this project to overcome, for example, COVID-19 and design the next society. We will accept several groups in this fall and then offer some money to analyze their proposal has a reality or not by themselves, And after 1 year's research, then we will have real selection and then offer bigger money to focus on their project for 5 years. This is a new style research in Japan to encourage women researchers, young people. This is the one.
Thank you, Hamaguchi-san. And so this whole perspective, I think, if I may compare with one acceleration program, it's a long-term, yes, highly focused on big impact. So thanks for sharing that as a model and as an emerging model coming from Japan.
Thank you.
Jim, over to you, Jim. Any final reflections and ideas on new models and the things that are emerging?
I think one thing which gives rise to significant optimism is the way that the vaccine project is being handled internationally. You know, we have something like 90 efforts, 90 distinct strategies almost going on around the world. They are distributed across the globe. They are exchanging information in a ways that we have, and at a speed that we have never seen before. And that is at a time when we're seeing these major global fractures in the political landscape across the world. But we are still able to collaborate on things which really matter. And that gives cause for some optimism. I think that we can use these type of models much more to address some of the pressing challenges that we have. Thanks.
So, and this ties back to something that you commented before about the amount of knowledge and information that we are generating, but also it highlights what Deborah mentioned about the confidence that we have on data and things that are coming up. But thanks for highlighting that model, Jim. Chad, once again, back to the things that we're doing and the whole commission work, what are some of the emerging models that you are seeing in the innovation space at large?
I'll just end on this final point, Roberto. In the United States, we have to rebuild, we have to reindustrialize, but that means we also have to reinvest. And I'll just give you one metric. In the United States, if you look at our federal investment in research and development over time, let's say the past 40 years, we are at an historic low. So that is not where we need to be. However, I will end on an optimistic note. Despite a hyper-polarized political environment, we are seeing emerging just this summer really interesting changes in the innovation zeitgeist in Washington, bipartisan, bicameral legislative efforts to, in some sense, kick off this rebuild, this reindustrialization. Two examples. One, Endless Frontier Act. This is an act that is really meant to perhaps completely transform our National Science Foundation with a much larger focus on technology development and deployment. Really interesting idea, controversial for some. We'll see where it goes, but bipartisan. Another one, the CHIPS Act. This is a bipartisan effort to reinvent America's advanced electronics, semiconductor industry, manufacturers through supply chain. Massively needed if we want to really be economically independent, secure, innovative across every industry sector that depends on advanced electronics. And that's everyone. So I think seeing those sorts of innovation ideas emerging, potential new investments occurring, that's how we're going to compete in the next economy.
Thanks for sharing this great examples on innovation in the policy conversation and the public engagement, Chad. Betty, over to you. Final ideas on what's emerging in the innovation space.
Yeah, I would just on closing reinforce as an invitation for everyone to think on those sort of three components that I think would create a lot of transformation. So when it's capital, is like, can you help mobilize more capital during sort of this crisis? That's definitely going to be, especially on the loan and investment, is going to be pretty short in the coming 2 years during the crisis and after the crisis. The second component is looking at what are the things that each can work around the creation of that market. And then the third component, just reinforce, is around the education and reskilling. And just to look at one thing in using that same framework, I know we haven't covered that much today, and it's like many of the CEOs and C-levels around the corporates, they can also like really use this as a way to look at a little bit of the reconstruction, not only for the companies, but also in the industry that they imagine that they would be in, and then opening that invitation to work a lot closely with founders, because the founders are used to innovation, they're used to changes and agility. So being able to build that mindset and that framework into your organization, I think it's highly, highly valuable. Last year, we've seen about over 20% of the entire venture activity came from the corporate venture capital. And that's a huge role, right? That the corporates also play into this equation. And they also can be the market consumption customer for many of those startups, and work very, very closely with the government and different entities and universities to see how we think about the advancement of the society. So just very excited to be able to be working very closely with the startups, with the founders, to really look at that framework and the need of those three components to combine together to catalyze a lot of the innovation that I believe could happen.
Close the gap between, let's say, different worlds and domains. Thanks for that, Betty. Deborah, over to you, your final reflections.
I just again want to thank everyone. It was a really rich, dynamic conversation with leaders and colleagues from around the world. So thank you so much. I'll just end on the issues of ethics and trust and what it really takes to have collaboration, which is the whole heart of the GFCC and why we're all together. I do think we're moving into a new era of, I don't know if I want to say universal ethics, but certainly around values that have come out so strongly during the COVID crisis and pandemic. And we know there's a deficit of trust, but we really have to innovate to ensure that going forward, we really have a agenda in our own countries, but globally that's going to innovate to a better quality of life and inclusivity for all our citizens. And, you know, one thought I have just, and again, my colleagues in Japan that we're very close with, you know, their culture of respect for the elderly was something that we saw in deficit in the United States. If you look at the COVID, you know, the majority of cases were with the elderly, the majority of deaths. We had a situation where elderly were being put into nursing homes that became, in effect, places where rapid death occurred. So that's both a moral and an innovation issue of how we're going to see a cradle to cradle innovation society that focuses on ethics and trust. And all the technologies are great, but at the end of the day, we're human beings. And so we have to come back to that fundamental component of what makes us human. And yes, we're in the man-machine world, but I still believe that we have souls and that we want to work together to not only advance humanity, but do so in an ethical world of trust. So thank you, Roberto, for bringing us together again for a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Deborah. And two final things before we finish this. First, if you are watching this conversation, we'll be back here next week talking digital transformation, digitalization with researchers, entrepreneurs coming from across the globe, from Africa to North America, from Central Asia to Europe. So join us next week. Second thing, we're taking a group picture. So for sure, we have everybody with their cameras on. And so please hold on, stay with me. Give me just a second. Yeah, here we go. Yep. So this was an amazing conversation. And I think I just want to finish with your words, Deborah, about values, but also as several colleagues shared before, and Chad, you mentioned that innovation for all. Thank you so much for joining. We'll be here next week. Bye-bye.